Good evening and welcome, everyone. My name is Marjorie O'Toole, and I'm the Executive Director of the Little Compton Historical Society. And I'm so happy you're here with us this evening to learn more about George Burleigh with the wonderful Jennifer Rycenga. Um, but in addition to being introduced to Jennifer in just a moment, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce you to Grace Leary. Grace is the newest member of the staff at the Little Compton Historical Society. She is our quite new program manager. And Grace put this event together this evening along with the two other lectures in our spring lecture series. And I would love to turn it over to Grace for her first Zoom lecture for the Historical Society.
No pressure at all.
This is a great group. There's minimal pressure.
All right. Hi, everyone. So, as Marjorie was saying, my name is Grace. I'm introducing the wonderful Jennifer, who's going to give us a great talk about the Burleigh family. Um, Jennifer has quite a few talents, but one of them being the Burleigh family and a lot of research that has gone into that. She is, and I'm sorry, I forgot to check. Jennifer, are you she, her?
Oh, she, her, yes.
Okay, awesome. Jennifer is a professor at San Jose State University, and has done a lot of her scholarly work focused on the abolitionist movement, especially exploring areas previously hidden or marginalized. This has also included some of her research into the Burleigh family as well, and we'll hear a little bit more about that in her talk today. She also has a ton of other works that are super interesting, including works on feminist musicology and global feminism. And she has some new works coming up that are focusing on the convergence of justice, history, art, and the natural world, which I'm excited to hear about at some point. But yeah, she's gonna give you guys a fantastic talk, mostly focused on George Burleigh, the father of uh, Sydney, who we've heard quite a bit about in Little Compton, and has connections to our historical society, as we have Peggotty, which is an art studio that he once used. I'll hand it over to you, Jennifer.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And I am honored to be your first guest. Uh, and let me just start by making sure everything's still working here and get this to the slideshow version. All right. So first, I want to thank the Little Compton Historical Society, the excellent new program director, Grace, and the director, Marjorie O'Toole. And I urge you all to tune in for her talk on the Sakonnet Wampanoag later this spring. And also a thank you for the careful work of Little Compton Historical Society in preserving so many Burleigh materials. You are one of the great Burleigh archives in the world. And I also wanted to thank the president of the board, Stephen Lubar, for his recent article on Burleigh's Circle of Friends in Little Compton, which, as soon as it was published, I believe tripled the amount of serious scholarship that exists on George Burleigh. So it was much appreciated, and it was added right away to the project. This is a gem of a museum you have in Little Compton, and you have some remarkable people to celebrate within its walls from your history, from the Sakonnet Wampanoag right to the present. I'm grateful too for this opportunity to discuss the life, activity, achievements, and shortfalls of George Shepard Burleigh for the first time in any full sense. It is an awesome responsibility that we historians take on to hold a life and that life's work in our hands. And in the case of George Burleigh, when I realized what I had actually bitten off, I didn't think I would ever be able to chew it all. it intimidated me when I realized how prolific he was as a professional writer, let alone the fact that he lived the longest life in years of any of the Burleigh siblings. And a little background of how I came to them. I was working on a book called Schooling the Nation that is about the Canterbury Female Academy, Prudence Crandall's school, famous. Prudence Crandall is the state heroine of Connecticut, and she is a Rhode Island native. So I was working on that school for African-American women, and I therefore became acquainted with the Burleigh family, because the Burleigh family was the white family who most quickly came to the assistance of those Black students and of the school. So let me just get this forward here. These are the 9 core members of the Burleigh family. The parents, Rinaldo and Lydia. Rinaldo was a school teacher. He was actually the preceptor of the then prestigious Plainfield Academy in Connecticut. And Lydia Bradford Burleigh, as you might guess from her name, was a direct lineal descendant of Governor Bradford of Plymouth. She took that heritage as a goad to keep improving and perfecting America, not as laurels to rest on. And she passed that spirit on to her children. They had 7 children who survived infancy, 1 daughter, and 6 sons. By the way, each of the 6 sons was over 6 feet tall, which was unusual at that time. And what I like to joke is that basketball not having been invented, they ended slavery instead. So they have to, another century when basketball comes along. Of the 9 members of the family, all 7 of the siblings and their parents were abolitionists who were active, for whom we have documentation of them being members of anti-slavery organizations or writing for or in some way being a speaker. 4 of them became major orators in the reform causes. 2 of them major poets. 4 of them active anti-slavery agents who would go from city to city trying to organize anti-slavery societies. And 3 of them serving also as agents in the temperance cause. This was a very active family, and being born as the youngest was probably difficult. There was a lot to live up to. Anyone who has seriously studied the abolitionist movement has heard of the Burleigh family, but no one has ever brought them all together or considered what it means for one family to have contributed so much to the movement. That's what I'm trying to do in the Digital Humanities Project, to which I will return, for which I'm the lead researcher, called The Burleigh Family of Plainfield, Connecticut, an Anti-Racist Legacy, because all 7 of the siblings had more regular contact with African Americans as associates and allies than was common at the time. So the aim of the project is to bring together as many resources as can be found. And that's why George was such a shock to me when I realized that we were dealing with easily 1,500 separate works that he published during his life. Of these siblings, the most famous is the one who's in the back middle there with the very long hair. That's Charles Callistus Burleigh, who was a noted speaker who shared his podium with some of the most famous orators, the ones we still speak about today, like Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, Wendell Phillips, William Lloyd Garrison, and he was considered an equal draw to those gentlemen. Frederick Douglass actually calls out both Charles and the man directly on his right, as we're looking at it, the brother William, for having supported him when very few white people would. So in that sense, Charles, again, was famous throughout the 19th century for his work. What is interesting is that George is nowhere known to have given a talk or a speech that was reported as such. It appears that being the youngest in such a voluble family left him somewhat mute. He wasn't particularly eager to give public talks. So both Charles and William figure in the rest of George's story, which is why I've singled them out here. A little quick look at George, kind of thumbnail sketch of his accomplishments. He was a professional writer. I refer to him here as a working poet, a phrase that may not make much sense to us now outside of the context of Hallmark cards, but might be applied to something like some of the great rap poets like Kendrick Lamar or the late Andrea Gibson, who considered themselves to be a spoken word artist. But in those days, poetry was largely a silent art. Yes, there were poets who read their work, but most poetry was absorbed through newspapers and magazines, and that's where George flourished. He was a thoroughly committed abolitionist. He was also a temperance advocate. I can give you a separate talk on that some other time. He also was a supporter of peace causes and suffrage for African American men and women of all races. He also opposed capital punishment, for which his brother Charles kind of wrote the book in the 19th century, The Anti-Capital Punishment Argument. And he was also a supporter of humane efforts in the treatment of animals. He seemed to have a particular admiration for heroic young women and girls. There is hardly, I don't think I can go more than 5 or 10 poems without encountering another heroic young woman. And I have my theories about why that happened. He was considered a fellow traveler by the American Transcendentalists. Despite the fact that his father was a deacon in the Congregational Church, we have no records that have been uncovered yet, at least, of George Burleigh being an official member of any church, including the one in Plainfield when he was young. He appears to have been a free thinker from the start, deeply Christian in his language and imagery, but not with a closed mind or in any way trying to put down other faiths. So again, that could be another talk for another time because I have to make some decisions, some editing decisions per se. So I put this together as a kind of outline of the changes in his life. For his first 20 years or so, he's the shy youth in a loud family. But then in the 1840s, he rises to the moment and the occasion, and he establishes a formidable literary and political profile. However, he's also doing that, for those of you who know the abolitionist struggle, he's doing that in a moment when the abolitionist movement is in the midst of a huge faction fight. The Garrisonians, who want to stick with moral suasion only, and the political abolitionists who start to form political parties that will run candidates in the hopes of building an anti-slavery constituency that can ultimately overturn the slave power. His two most respected older brothers are on different sides of that divide. Charles is a Garrisonian through and through. William becomes a leading member of the Liberty Party and is editing newspapers that support the Liberty Party. And so George Burleigh found himself in an environment where he had to take sides sometimes. And he made some mistakes that I think cost him in later bravery. When the 1850s came around, he had just married and he had just had that girl child. I can't imagine a man who more wanted to be a girl dad than George Burleigh. And unfortunately, that child did not live long. And then the far more famous, certainly to you in Little Compton, Sidney Richmond, came along only a few months after the death of the sister he would never know. And George found himself suddenly in the midst of all the contradictions, personal sadness, and what to do about political abolition. I will come back to that and where it leads you. To the point that he was practically silent during the Civil War. There are fewer poems of his from the early 1860s than any other period of his adult life. The contradictions of the Civil War for pacifists were immense. And yet the goal of ending slavery was suddenly in sight. And so in 1867, after the war is over, George seems to make a turn towards education, towards children, and in his deep and abiding love for the coastline of eastern Rhode Island to nature. And by the 1890s, as he's realizing that he has outlived all of his brothers, he turns to reflect upon the life he has lived. And thank you, George, he put all of his own papers in order, most of them at the Hague. Nice job. I recommend this to authors who are long-lived. This is what we are left with. Over 900 poems, 600 of which are already in the Digital Humanities Project. Big shout out here to Lizzie Carr, who did a lot of the initial transcriptions. I've been putting them in at the rate of 3 or 4 a day for half a year. His prose works are similarly extensive, not quite as many in number, but they're often many more pages in length, with all kinds of political fiction, aesthetic and naturalist topics. And many of the later works, including a 14-part series, concern the coastline of Little Compton, a series called Sea Things, that looks at sea creatures both great, like seals, and very small, like anemones and so on. And these will gradually be transcribed and placed in the project as well. He also did extensive writing for children in both poetry and songs, and published in well over 100 different kinds of publications. I'm assuming that number might end up pushing 200 by the time I'm done. So just to take it through a little chronologically, he had a very uneven education. The district schools, and then he would occasionally go to school at the Plainfield Academy. We know this because his brother closest in age to him, Cyrus, who was just a year older, kept a very good journal of the last 2 years when he was attending Plainfield Academy. And he would say, George came with me today. But it wasn't every day, because George was needed on the farm. Their father had retired from teaching at this point because he was gradually, and it would turn out ineradicably, losing his eyesight. And so he really needed the boys to be on the farm and doing the work. And so in Cyrus's diary, there's often notes of all the work George was doing, and it tended to be heavier work than Cyrus was doing because Cyrus had health issues. So George would be putting up a fence on the east side of the buckwheat, plowed on the old orchard lot, set the store of wheat out to dry, and Father and George got a load of it into the barn. This is nearly every day. I just opened up to random places my transcription of Cyrus's journal. It's like, yep, there's George working again and again and again and again. So that's what his youth was like. But he has written a bit more about it. In the 1890s, an editor wanted him to write a little biography, which, true to his sense of anonymity, he wrote in the third person. And he said, his better schooling was in the intervals of rest in his solitary attic, with no teacher and few books. Here he first courted the muse and never told his love. So he knew he was a poet from a very young age. He chooses this vocation. But there's also two poems, one from 1871, where probably at this point he's taken Sydney through to age 18, so he knows what it looks like, and he goes, to me, a timid, shrinking lad, oft rude for shyness, often mute for very fullness, rarely glad but when alone with bird and brute. And we can sense here already this love of the natural world, but the fact that he's quiet because he has so much to write, not necessarily to enunciate out loud, but to write. And in a tragic poem that he wrote about a little boy who is into botany but dies young, called The Little Botanist, I sense something autobiographical there too. says, "For you, my heart all over the hills went out in my dreaming hours, and where a fresh green betrayed the rills, where the peeweets dipped their little bills, it dwelt among the flowers. In glens where the earliest bird notes rung through the woody paths to tread, where the spider's web on the bushes hung, with beads of gold and diamonds strung on every glittering thread." And by the way, you can pick up some of his skill, which is a very 19th century skill, in the rhyming schemes and in the cross-line use of rhythms. That he's not one of the great poets, but he certainly is a capable working poet. And that's obvious in these little examples already. One of the earliest artifacts we have from Burleigh is an 1840 journal of his. He would have been 19 years old at the time. We can pick out from the epigram he has there from Burns, which is a semi-humorous piece of Robert Burns. He was reading some of the politically radical poetry for the time. We know he was reading Cooper as well. And we have a similar notebook from 1842 that's at the Hay at Brown. But frankly, by 1842, Burleigh was no longer an apprentice in any sense. He was no longer a mere student of poetry. Because starting in 1841, he had publications, but very few of them under his own name. This is a really almost a psychologically analyzable degree of shyness. Or to put it in more 19th century terms, this is the kind of modesty that was expected of women writers more than of a man writer. So the range of these publications is quite interesting. A devotional piece, temperance poems, a humorous piece, a polemical piece as part of that abolitionist breakup, a nostalgic short story, and an excellent volume of his collected poems, all in the first decade of his work. And by the way, this wasn't the only thing he was doing, which we'll see in a moment. This first one, it is simply a mission of mine in life now to correct every library in the country. There's your title page, The Descent from the Cross, a poem by Lucian Burleigh, if you skip the small print. It was delivered in Hartford by Lucian Burleigh. It was not written by Lucian Burleigh, who is another older brother of George's. Lucian just was a good speaker. He ends up becoming a Baptist minister. The man could speak just fine. George couldn't read his own poem, even though there was a traveling exhibit of a replica of Rubens' famous painting that was the occasion for this poem. George's brothers had it figured out. We have letters from both Charles and William that they say, "We know whose poem this is, cut it out." And here's William saying, "I never knew of Lucian's writing a line of poetry, and this one is not a first production, not exactly apprentice hand." And yeah, so certainly George fessed up to his brothers pretty quickly. But I can't really blame the librarians for thinking this was written by Lucian Burleigh. So I'm going to have to work on that. It's really quite an interesting poem. It's retelling, obviously, of the Christian Passion narrative, in particular, its tragic ending. And each one of the characters who comes to depose Jesus's body is described as a separate character. And there's a great deal of subtlety in the way that George imagines that. It's a kind of biblical exegesis. It's also very clear that he's analogizing it to the abolition movement. One of the most famous kind of on-scene first-person accounts of the abolitionist movement was written by the great European activist and feminist Harriet Martineau under the title of The Martyr Age in America, about the abolitionist movement. And George was familiar with that rhetoric. So, for instance, there's a line near the end: "The blazing column moved before the march of freedom and of God." And speaking there of the changes that allegedly took place over the earth at the moment of the crucifixion. But seeing that as a moment of both triumph and of horror. In 1841 and 42, George was also published in a very prestigious annual volume that the Garrisonians put out called The Liberty Bell. And by the way, if you didn't know this, the Liberty Bell was turned into the Liberty Bell in popular culture by the abolitionists. It was part of their movement for understanding desire to end slavery, that freedom for all who could hear it ring. And you can see that in the cover I have from the 1853 Liberty Bell, the use of the symbol. And in there, we can see in a poem called World Harmonies, which reflects George's budding transcendentalism as well, when he says, "Woe that man's sin should check the eternal flow of nature's melody and rudely break earth's concord with the lyres of heaven. Woe, woe, that the high soul, for sordid mammon's sake, should fashion fetters for its brother soul, binding the thoughts which mount where the star anthems roll." So a very strong call for equality. There doesn't have to be a mention of race in there. It's just slavery is wrong in all cases. And it is the attempt to enchain the mind of a fellow soul. But I have another one there, The Descent from the Cross. It's where he's describing Mary Magdalene, of course, using the common mythology, not Dan Brown, but the common mythology of as it was understood at his time. "Woman's heart, in the deep chambers of its secret thought, will cherish memories of the eventful past and brood with holy fervency o'er words that fall unheeded and unregistered in man's insentient bosom. Woman's soul will nerve her to new scenes untried before." And my best reading of this is that George is positing that Mary Magdalene's closeness with Jesus becomes a kind of female ancestral memory that women can tap when they need it, including for public speaking. And George was, from the moment we know him as an adult, in favor of women's public speaking, which, by the way, not all men were. And I would add here, we have a scholar of women of the prominence of Elizabeth Stevens with us, that I think it's fair to say that the number of pro-feminist men, I'm not talking about men who actually are nice to women and allow women's rights to continue, I'm talking about men who actually take a position in favor of women and are advocating for women, that number is still few in the annals of history. And when we find them, we need to cherish them. And I mean, there's a few places where George falls into gender stereotyping of his time, but relatively few, and many more that are like this, that are suggesting that women actually have a knowledge that will help them to liberate not only themselves, but the whole race, the whole human race. And as if to back that up, one of the first people, another Rhode Island original, to notice George's talents was Frances Harriet Whipple, who goes through many names as well as many husbands. And Frances Harriet Whipple actually writes to George and his good friend James Monroe, who later becomes the president of Oberlin, writes them and says, "I want you guys to contribute to this journal I'm putting together specifically for the Lowell factory girls and the other women workers." And so George Burleigh may have contributed as much to that very short-lived journal, it didn't even make a full year's run, as anyone. He has 4 separate poems in it, including one that honors a local site of the Quinnebog, the people from Eastern Connecticut. So that's another very pro-feminist moment. But I don't want you to think that he was all just serious. Not at all. This guy was a lot of fun. I imagine that George Burleigh always had a bit of a twinkle in his eye. And I think those of you in Little Compton who know him more from his dotage know all about that little twinkle in the eye, because you see it much more often in his writing for children. But this is probably his most famous poem ever. It was certainly his most anthologized one. It is an elaborate elaboration of the basics of the house that Jack built. with all kinds of great vocabulary. It kind of presages that later work for children. It is wonderfully constructed, and it's still a great deal of fun to read out loud. And again, I invite you to go to the website to read the whole thing. I will treat you to these verses that we have here because they deal with cats. So my cat specifically asked that we do this one. Behold the mansion reared by Tattle Jack. See the malt stored in many a plethoric sack. In the proud cirque of Ivan's bivouac, mark how the rat's felonious fangs invade the golden stores in John's pavilion laid. Anon, with velvet foot and Tarquin strides, subtle Grimalkin to his quarry glides. Grimalkin grim that slew the fierce rodent, whose tooth insidious Johann's sackcloth rent. Lo now the deep-mouthed canine foes assault, that vexed avenger of the stolen malt, stored in the hallowed precincts of that hall that rose complete at Jack's creative call. The whole thing works like that. It's such fun. He published it anonymously because that's what George Burleigh was doing at this time. This time he regretted it because this poem got republished, reprinted, anthologized. He didn't get a penny for it. Changes would be made, wouldn't get a penny for it, could barely complain. But we know from the documents he left that it was his poem, and this fits with his style. It's just one of the best examples of that style. Come on now, come on, machine. There we go. But his really big break happened when his brother William became the editor of Connecticut's Liberty Party newspaper, Connecticut's anti-slavery paper of the 1840s. And William already knew that his younger brother was a very talented poet and would publish poems by him, as well as some short stories. But in 1847, William elevated his younger brother to being a co-editor of the newspaper, which at that time was named the Charter Oak, for a famous story having to do with Connecticut's revolutionary, actually Connecticut's time during the Restoration when they had to hide because there were a lot of Puritans looking for them. So William and George become co-editors, and that means that George gets the opportunity to write many of the lead editorials. What's going on 1847-48? The war with Mexico.
Meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Thank you, Karen. So the war with Mexico is going on, and more African Americans from the South are self-emancipating. They're running away, and Northerners are protecting them. You're starting to see what we now call the Underground Railroad forming. And this is where we get a different side of George than we had before. These are two of his strongest pieces against the war with Mexico, and there are many of them. But he starts the one on the right there, A Southern War, by saying that he quotes from a Charleston paper that says, let's remember that the war with Mexico is a Southern war. And he says, I, men of the North, we trust you will remember it too. And when the government would make bloodhounds of you to track the wild rancheros to their guerrilla dens in the mountain fastnesses, that you will answer no. It is a Southern war, let the South bear it. Let them send out their own hot bloods to play the hound and give their lives for slavery. Our hands have better trades. We can plane and saw and swing sledgehammers and drive the whistling spindles for 1,000 looms. I and the wizard printing press, we can wield that. And while these things are for the blessing of our kind, and war is murder, robbery, and all crime, we will not soon exchange our work for that. That's an editorial written by a poet. You can hear it as I'm reading it. It has list poem, it has a real rhythm there at the end. And yet it's also a politically aware person who's like, we've got the better part here. We don't have to play in this war. It's not Thoreau's Letter from Prison. It doesn't have that same impact. It's very much in the moment, but it is a kind of revolutionary journalism that was opening the door for other interpretations. And then up above, this is the guy who wrote The Domicile Erected by John. Our army in Mexico are proving themselves very valorous against everything insurrectionary. If but the moon rises, they'll muster and try to suppress it. And holding that everything on trees is trees on, they put all fruits as rebels in the act. Autumnal eaves give them apples and they eat. Melons are cut up with a melancholic pleasure, and potatoes found with balls in their possession are accused of being in arms and so are taken in hand. If a pig squeals in his sleep, they take it as a personality, and he is hauled over the coals. We know that soldiers are used to steel as well as lead, but that is no good reason why they should be led to steal. So he's making a moral point, still having fun with words. No, why sometimes it wants to turn and other times it doesn't. Okay, one more. And then on the matter of fugitives, or self-emancipated. First of all, to the left there, he pulls up how there is in Missouri, a free black person had to have papers on them at all times, shall we say, to prove their citizenship. I don't know why that came into my head as an issue. But when he starts his editorial, he says, this is a free country. Say what you will about its foibles. A free democratic country where a free man must beg a license before he can walk the streets of some of its cities. Free men not asking for a license to breathe and walk are arrested. The dogs of the law are set onto them as if they were some terrible crime to be free. And so it is for an N-word. How dare they offend the majesty of American liberty by presuming to live without a master? The slaves are so contented and happy that the sight of a free black man would make them proud and insolent toward their poorer brothers who have no kind masters to see to their wants. This is the secret of treating freedom as criminal in the South. It is all pure benevolence and a desire to make the slaves humble in their surpassing exaltation. Will a people who call themselves free long maintain sustain a system which makes such infamous abuse of free men necessary to sustain its infernal power? You shall see. Men of the North are tamer than meekness, and will bear long before they rise even noble resentment, much less to noble forgiveness. So that's like how. When are you going to stop being so patient about this? That our citizens are being asked to reveal their papers. But his very best essay of them all is entitled Hooray for Humanity. And it begins with the story of a successful self-emancipation aided by a mob in their favor by three black men from Missouri who escaped into Illinois. And he opens it with another slave hunt and another rescue. The poor, blind-hearted minions of the oppressor will begin to learn that a man is not to be transformed into a slave so lightly as they have thought. That once brought into the circle of human sympathies, a brother is not easily snatched back to the old den from which he is escaping. Let the oppressor tremble when he sees man rousing in the deep strength of passionless resolve, when the thunder of congregated thousands swells not with the cry of battle upon him, but with the shout of joy and sympathy for his freed victims. Did he but know such a band of exulting freemen is more terrible and fatal to his bloody wrong than armed battalions thronging his very towers. Brute force can be as well applied by brutish men for evil as by good men for the truth. But this impalpable outflow of a moral sense and of large-hearted sympathy baffles the oppressor, for he has nothing of the kind to call into service here. All that he has of nobleness and good are in conspiracy with the nobility and goodness of all men against his mighty wrong. He stands dumb and powerless before the immeasurable force of a free utterance of the free heart's fullness. His revolver cannot shoot it, nor his bowie knife stab it, and he knows well that to reply, he lacks the vital truth, the electric flash of liberty, which makes their words effective. George didn't develop this fully, but I would put it to you that he has outlined the best philosophic argument for the phrase we use now, love wins. He's suggesting that there is something in the taste of human freedom that the oppressor does not have. It is the one weapon that neither side, that side doesn't have access to, because the other weapons both sides have access to. And I will tell you, I've experienced this in my own life, which happened at the time of the Obergefell decision, when all of the joyous couples who had just won marriage equality went to their various city halls and places of worship and got married. The joy was such that even the opponents of same-sex marriage just kind of hid out, didn't want to be seen, because they knew they couldn't match it. It's an interesting moment from George. So what happened to this man? We should know about this man. But what happened is his brother took another job over in New York State, working exclusively for the temperance cause. George, meanwhile, had moved to Rhode Island, because back in 1844, he'd met a young woman named Ruth Burgess, probably even earlier than that, might have been 1843. But they were pretty friendly by 1844, traveling together. And by 1847, George had moved to Rhode Island, and he seems to have settled almost immediately in Little Compton, because by 1849, he and Ruth were married. As I've already mentioned, their daughter was born in 1850 and died in 1852, and their son born in 1853. So I put the little dots on the map there for Plainfield and Little Compton, which are the only residences George ever had, to those two towns. And who was Ruth Burgess Burleigh? Well, she was an abolitionist herself, and of course, a native of Little Compton. She and her father had left the local Congregational Church as come-outers. That was a major movement in which people would defy their ministers to stand out against slavery, and if they didn't, they would leave the church. It was a major protest movement. Ruth was also a poet and women's rights activist and advocate. And in our Burleigh project, we have an entire page dedicated to Ruth Burgess Burleigh. And I wanted to call this out as primarily the work of Lizzie Carr, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Rochester, currently working here in Rochester at the George Eastman Museum. And her specialization as an historian is in reconstructing the hidden lives of marginalized people, like workers and women. And so she took a special delight in bringing Ruth Burgess Burleigh back into something like fullness. And I'll go show you that page at the end if we have time. Really is nice. While I have no doubt that George Burleigh was crazy in love with a fellow poet and Ruth Burgess, he also fell really hard for that great profundity, the sea, and especially the sea around Little Compton. In his first writings for the Charter Oak, after his move to Rhode Island, he did a short series called Letters from a Long Shore. And the first one, from June 10th of 1847, ends this way. Say what you will of the sentimental bearings of the case. This fresh sea air, cool and pure from the bosom of the great deep, will give one an appetite with a little wholesome labor on the soil to open the pores to its breath. And I assure you, a few weeks' try-daily return of the ever-smoking Indian cake will put a plump flesh coat over the bones of the driest, sallowest city skeleton of an editor or printer that shakes his anatomy along your pavements. That quote about the sallow skeleton was about his brother William. But notice what he writes right next to that about seeing the sea. After a few miles of pleasant travel, I did see it. The veritable, eternal, ever-heaving immensity of blue, the weltering, boundless ocean. There it lay, this mighty Atlantic, all that the eye could compass of it, tumbling in its great waves from the outer infinite, wave on wave in overwhelming majesty, piling the shore with a long white line of shivered billows trampled into foam, and the great groan of their death agony came up with the whoop of charging ranks, a voice of terror and of grandeur. my goodness, these 19th century people could write even if it was a little purplish. But the outer infinite, he's ontologizing the ocean like a full traveler with the Transcendentalists. You can really feel it there. So I've already spoken about Lillian's death and how much that affected her parents. But along comes Sidney Richmond Burleigh, who is very well known to all of you. I'm not going to spend much time talking about him. Of course, I hope you've all at least driven by the Fleur de Lis building in Providence. And of course, his fame regionally helps extend his father's fame even after George has passed away. Sidney Richmond's name actually reflects both his mother and his father. Richmond was Ruth's mother's family name. Sidney came from one of George's closest friends, a radical thinker, A. Sidney Southworth, who decided that he and his girlfriend didn't need to get married if they were part of a utopian colony, that being the Northampton Association. And that turned out to be the line that was too far for even the Northampton Association. That kind of unconventional behavior never crossed the mind of George Burleigh, but it did become an actuality in the life of his friend, who then would bequeathed his name of Sidney to the more famous painter. The 1850s and early 1860s are a real low point, I feel, in George's output. And nothing signifies this better than the full-length book that he wrote as a campaign document for John C. Fremont, the first national candidate for the newly created Republican Party that was avowedly anti-slavery, or at least against the extension of slavery. George Burleigh was given 2 weeks to write a series of laudatory, heroic poems on the, to use our own language, colonizing and extirpating of Native Americans that had marked John Fremont's career in California. George Burleigh was still allegedly a pacifist, and he's having to write what is essentially war literature, as well as an ethnically dangerous literature about the killing of a lot of Native Americans. It's not good poetry. It was in service of a campaign. Obviously, Fremont didn't win. He got a booby prize of a town named after him with really bad traffic in California. That's about it. But this was exactly what George's brother Charles had warned against by holding to moral suasion only. Don't get involved in electoral politics because it's all compromise. And I don't think George ever was able to figure it out after writing this pablum. We don't have those great editorials anymore because there's no place for him to put them. We don't have the poems that sing that loudly of the movement. To do a content comparison to the things I read you on the Mexican War would be embarrassing to George, so I'm not going to do it, but you can do it. All those poems are in my collection. And then the virtual silence during the Civil War. 2 occasional pieces that were for big abolitionist celebrations in the middle of the war, trying to push the cause along. And then 1 Lincoln Remembrance. I don't even know what year it was written. Obviously after the war is over, and to commemorate his birthday. And 1 other poem about a heroic little girl called The Freed Girl. And it was about a young Black girl who had moved to Rhode Island after her parents had run over to the Union side and had escaped to the North. And in it, she addresses all those others who still need to be liberated. And so his best Civil War poem is about a heroic Black girl. The moment when the change becomes final was in a very long poem, which I hope none of you ever have to read, called The Teacher, from 1867. It was written for the anniversary of the Connecticut Normal School, the oldest public university in Connecticut. And in it, it is clear that he has turned his gaze over into the question of how wisdom is continued across generations and the role of teachers. And he foretells the futures of a variety of different kinds of students in an elementary classroom. It's more forward-looking than nostalgic, despite being hopelessly sentimental. Philosophically, he's trying to pull all world history together into a harmony rather than conflict. He embraces technological change, which has been a theme throughout. In fact, I think he may have written one of the earliest poems about the telephone ever. And he's still political. He ends the poem with a call for the suffrage of women and African Americans. But his politics are muted and universalized compared to the specifics of those pieces on the Mexican-American War or the fugitives escaping from slavery. And as an example of that universalization, he says, all the dead nations in their funeral urn shall teach the lesson that they would not learn, that men are brothers and they build to fall in hopeless ruin, who build not for all. And of course, he's delivering this at one of the few coeducational institutions, as well as an institution that after the war was open to African Americans in Connecticut. But at this point, the juvenilia begins, the work for children, children's literature. He was lucky to be active during the golden era of book illustration and magazine illustration. Lots and lots of delightful pieces. We have a nice page on that in the project. His humor and wordplay are contagious. They're quite joyful, but the poems are almost all conventional. But boy, those heroic girls keep showing up. Now nymphs, sprites, and naiads, as well as young women. The pieces about animals are particularly incisive, but as you can see from the picture up there on the left, sometimes they're a little weird. Speaking as someone who was a weird aunt herself, I was pleased that there was a poem about aunt's mummy cat. These little children had an aunt who had gotten one of those mummies from Egypt that was of a mummified cat. And the little girl says, ew, I like my real living cat a lot better in the poem. And then there in the lower right-hand corner, a favorite of mine and Lizzie's, the frog who uses a mushroom as an umbrella. Another example of these illustrations, George Burleigh had an encyclopedic knowledge of birds that included a love for crows. That's a man who knows his birds. You love your crows. Here's two more exceptional illustrations, especially the one on the right. W. Holledge is a very famous artist, but the one on the left is a very good example of these wraparound illustrations that would be done of the poems. And now that little botanist had become an active naturalist. George Burleigh, as I mentioned, wrote the Sea Things column. He wrote one on crabs. And in the last paragraph of it, he says I've had his big brother Cancer draw blood through my fingernail with one pinch of the pretty blue claw. So yeah, George Burleigh got down and dirty with the crabs, picked them on up. And then his sea sonnets are a series that includes, I think, some of his finest nature writing. He did very well in the sonnet form. I really think it was his best form for a variety of reasons as a poet. And he, as a naturalist, he made sure to share his knowledge with adults and children. And I think that's the sign of someone who was really dedicated to that particular pursuit. It's both scientific and aesthetic. So let me finish up here with a few slides. George Burleigh has plenty of contradictions. They're the ones that bedeviled a lot of the white abolitionists. And that's true even of someone like Burleigh, who came from a family that had plenty of depth on this issue. I mean, I think his brother Charles was way ahead of him on a lot of this, both the anti-racism and the pro-feminism. But Burleigh didn't know how to reconcile the Civil War with the end result of it being the abolition they'd all sought. And he never could figure it out, and he never really approaches it. He embraced prohibition as a cause, despite its class dynamics, its hostility to immigrants, and its moral absolutism, which, by the way, I have learned, the people who were conducting the movement at the time were aware of those things. It isn't just us scholars finding it later. He would sometimes take patronizing attitudes towards African Americans, towards immigrants and Native peoples. And in his writings on Native peoples, he's usually seeking assimilation. And that was very commonplace at the time. But he also often shared that white belief, even if tinged with poetic sadness, that Native peoples were fading away. Especially as he was aging, he started to favor sentiment and conventionality over any form of concrete and specific change. Even the support for women's suffrage starts to die out by the 1880s and 1890s in his writing. And he participated uncritically in American expansionism. Obviously, that would have been happening in that Fremont volume, but in a few other places too. And in something that I consider kind of a cardinal sin among poets, he doesn't question his own presumptions very often. And it doesn't take much to find 19th century poets who did. I think Whittier does. I think Elizabeth Barrett Browning does, just to mention other abolitionists among the poets. Now, none of these shortcomings were unique to Burleigh, but I think naming them helps us to see what we have as a resource in our own American heritage of those who changed society and where they fell down and where we can do better. Because the evils they were combating, we still are. So in some, I think he was sharpest in that 1843 to 1850 time span, and then collapsed into sentiment. But he did speak of how much he prized having been part of the movement for freedom and human progress. So he knew what had happened. But what he substituted instead was an attention to nature, that botanizing and love of the sea. And that experience of wanting to be a father to a heroic daughter, which was denied him by Lillian's death, instead falls to the young women of Little Compton, his neighbors, like Bessie Gray, who's the woman shown on the far left in this picture from the Little Compton collection. And so why bother with George Burleigh? Well, in short, neither his writings nor his activity as an abolitionist, nor his work as a poet, nor his documenting of the natural history of the Sakonnet coast, nor his being the father of a famous painter, none of them is sufficient in and of themselves to ensure George Burleigh's historical significance. But when we put them together, his genuine importance emerges. His was a life well lived, with consistent integrity, and with an eye to sharing both beauty and truth. He mostly stayed within the given confines of his era, but at his best, he transcended those limitations. Here's how he put it in that letter to the publisher in the 1890s, again in third person, excuse me. When he was at length lured into print, he concealed his personality under various names and initials, contributing stirring lyrics to that mighty struggle for liberty and reform, which has made the heart of this century so grand in human history. And if the heart is the center, that's 1840, 1850, 1860, right? So he rose to the challenge of the most transformative moment in this nation's history, the struggle against slavery. And his contributions were intellectual and aesthetic, involving the mind and emotions in service of humanity. He was alive to the heart of his century, and he moved that needle towards freedom. So thank you very much. And I've left a few resources for you here. I will be speaking on my book locally at the Mystic Congregational Church in Connecticut on Wednesday, March 25th, and I would be honored to see some of you there. Thanks very much.
Now, we did not say this at the beginning of the talk, but if anyone has any questions, I believe Jennifer's willing to try, or not try, but she's willing to answer people's questions. And I think the best way to deliver them to us is to type them into the chat, and then either Grace or I can sort of deliver them.
And I also have the chat window open if someone puts them there.
Great. So one thing that had never occurred to me before, Jennifer, and I don't know if there's anything to this, it's really a genealogy question. Or maybe it's not. Maybe you already know the answer. Do you know why George had the middle name Shepard? And
yes.
Okay.
I can tell you, there was a famous congregational minister by the name of George Shepard who had started his ministerial career in Plainfield, Connecticut. And then he goes on to lead a congregation in Maine where he's much more famous. Rinaldo Burleigh, George's father, had worked with that George Shepard. So he knew him personally, and so it was an honorific naming to name him George Shepard.
Okay.
I think by the time George Shepard Burleigh had become famous, George Shepard's own fame had fallen, and people don't make that connection. But it was once I got the pieces together, I'm like, oh, it's that George Shepard. So yeah.
Okay, so we had Mace Shepard here, who had a whole bunch of kids, several of whom became ministers. And I'll check the genealogy and see if was a George, because I can't recall off the top of my head. But the Shepard family moved to moved to Amherst, Massachusetts after our minister died. So it's not anyway, it might be a thing.
It would not shock me, and it would also, I mean, even though it might not be a genealogical connection with the Burleigh family, but it wouldn't surprise me if literally the name had predestined George to go to Little Compton. If there was some connection there. So that would be fascinating to know. Yeah, all right. So yeah, what would be his causes today? And I'm not sure he would use AI. I think he was but I would say that yes, he would be someone who could have flourished in an atmosphere of increased communication. He was taking advantage of that in his own time, right? He was already moving to publish in as many venues as were open to him. He was someone who, as I said, his ability to write those very hot editorials, that ability goes away when he doesn't have the avenue through his brother. But I would think he could have continued that kind of work if he had the kind of social media landscape that we do now. Now, as to what his causes would be, I don't know. I certainly have a suspicion that he would certainly still be to the left, but I don't think he would necessarily be at the most radical edges of that left. I think he would more likely be, again, somewhat conventional still. He liked a lot of the simple things in life that require those conventions. But as I say, his embrace of technology is really quite interesting. He uses daguerreotype, for instance, as a way to describe God's actions a few times, like that we are God's daguerreotype. He talks about the train, both with that romantic disdain for the noise that the train brings, but also with some appreciation for the improvement in communication that it's brought. He writes this children's poem about the telephone, in which a little girl imagines she's watched her mother make phone calls, and so she's trying to call. The little girl is now trying to call a hospital to take care of her doll who's sick, and so that child's imitation of a parent, which is again something about the penetration of a technology. Right. So, and Marjorie helped me last summer to understand that would have been a scene that he would have witnessed in when he was staying in Providence, because it had a wider directory of numbers than existed in Little Compton in the 19th century. So, fascinating little tidbits like that that would indicate that George was a progressive in the general sense of that term. Okay, and I just did that, Steve. Thank you for that. But you know what? I could I'm just going to take a moment. I'll find the telephone page here because I do love it. And I'll also show you the page um, on Ruth, which I just think is so wonderful. I'll go there first because that's easier. So yeah, let me go back to share here and highlight Lizzie's work. So yeah, this is the two pictures I was using, as you can see, the 1855 and then one that I guess is in the 1890s at some point. Not dated, but we have a very good history of her schooling from Ruth Burgess Burleigh that Lizzie read carefully and summarized there. And then some more on the actual family. And then the story of how the walkout happened from the come outer walkout in the Congregational Church. So she would have been 22 or 23 at the time of that walkout. And I found a reference in one of Cyrus's diaries where he says that Ruth seems much happier now that she's taken her own spiritual decisions into her own hands. So Cyrus could see it in her right then and there. And then her very close friendship with her mother-in-law, Lydia Burleigh. And so we have a little bit about that there. And then the sweet little Valentine that she wrote to her son, Sidney Richmond, who was called Richie by his Uncle Charlie. And so all of this excellent work by Lizzie. And we are working on a catalog of Ruth's writings and poetry in particular. And I think at this point we're up to about 15 or 16 poems that we found, and those will all be added to the project as well.
Wow.
That'll give you some sense of who she was. She joined the Women's Club Cirrhosis, which sounds like a liver disease, but was actually one of the oldest and most important of the women's clubs. And now let me get to the telephone in here. Yeah. So yeah, this is the illustration of the telephone poem. And you can see there the little girl using a play phone like a child, and there's the sick. Look at how sick that doll is. That doll needs help. But it says, it says, thank you, Mama. Now I'll try to get 7129, Auntie's house, to talk with mine all through, Mama dear. So that's a number that would have been too high for Little Compton. So we know this happened when the way that George lived the last few years of his life, probably the last decade, was he would spend the winters up in Providence living with his son Sidney, and then go back to Little Compton in the summers. So this probably came from something he had observed in Providence. There are no direct descendants of George. Sidney and his wife Sarah did not have any children of their own. I don't know if they ever had a child who didn't survive infancy. I don't believe so. So they never had any children of their own. So there are no direct descendants. There are, however, direct descendants of some of the other brothers. So, and I know that some of them attended the talk I gave for Historic Northampton a few weeks ago on the older brother Charles. So there are still living descendants who are deeply invested in the history of the family and are glad to see that it's getting a bit more attention. So, not just from me, but from Dr. Lewis as well.
Another thing that occurred to me when you were speaking, Jennifer, or it was on one of your slides. Mm-hmm. George translated something from Victor Hugo. So mm-hmm. his neighbor across the street, America's first Egyptologist, Charles Edwin Wilbur, translated Les Mis. And was good friends with Victor Hugo when he was in Paris. So I don't know if that's purely a coincidence or if there's some connection.
George was not only shy, but he wasn't much of a traveler.
Uh-huh.
His other brothers go across the country, like they you could follow their exploits as the railroads expand, and he's like, nope, just I'm fine here, just let me write my book. Um, so he would not have made the trip to France to meet Victor Hugo, but the idea that he could talk to someone who had that, yeah, and I have not yet investigated that fully because that's a huge manuscript at the Hay. They actually have the original manuscript of it, and I at the time was trying to learn different Romance language. I didn't want to mess my mind up with my old French knowledge. But I'll go back in some point and take a look. And that I just have to remember that valuable hint because the Wilburs do come up in a number of other contexts in George's life that we've seen. So they're clearly friends or at least friendly acquaintances.
Yeah. No, I think close friends. Charlotte Wilbur was the founder of Cirrhosis, so that would explain Ruth's participation in that. And if George was ever going to see a mummy cat, the mummy cat probably belonged to the Wilburs.
Right, exactly. That makes very good sense. Now, of course, that was a whole craze at the time. A lot of tombs were scavenged for anything that was in mummified form, and that included a lot of cats because the Egyptians understood the importance of cats. More power to them. So yeah, apparently there were anyone who wanted one could have a cat. That's what it came down to. But yeah, if he was going to see one in Little Compton, it probably would have been at the Wilburs. I see where you go with that. But yeah, that's one of the weirder poems, I'll tell you. I remember when Lizzie and I discovered that when we were reading, you were like, whoa. We had to do a good piece of research to find out just how thick that craze of mummified cats was in America. Yeah.
All right. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So I think we may all thank Jennifer for her time and her expertise and her storytelling this evening. And Jennifer, in the chat, would you put the web address for your digital project?
Yeah, hang on a second. I'll go fetch that because it's not an intuitive one.
Okay.
Sadly. And yeah, it's home based at my old institution. I'm now a retired professor. Shall I say giddily retired? And there is that link. And again, if you wanted to write me, if you know more things like these cool hints that I'm getting from Marjorie, you can always email me, and I have that up there. And again, the talk that I'm giving on March 25th is under the auspices of the Mystic River Historical Society or something. I forget if it's Historical Society or Association, but it's something like that. Those of you can make it.
Yeah. And we'll try to reshare that website when we put the video of today's lecture up. We'll make sure we put that website as a link as well.
Wonderful. And again, I just want to share my applause here with Lizzie Carr, who is present. So thank you so much, Lizzie. You helped make all of this possible. I mean, you may be the I don't know, you and Steve might have to fight it out. Who knows the second most about George Burleigh? You have spent a lot of time transcribing those poems, so I know you know a lot. And I'm very grateful to the entire team Burleigh for the work they've done.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. All right. And thank you, Grace, for putting this all together for us.
Yes.
We hope you all have a wonderful evening. And please, our next talk is by Little Compton part-time resident Alan Hoffman, who probably knows more about Lafayette than anybody in the world. And he is going to share that knowledge about Lafayette in the Revolution and his anti-slavery work. So please join us next month, and Grace will be putting out social media and emails about that. But our website couldn't be simpler. It's littlecompton.org. And if you go there, you can sign up for Alan's talk in April and my talk on the Sakonnet Wampanoag people in May. Right. Thank you all and good night.